Welcome back. So in this lesson, we will be talking about Boolean expressions and conditionals, things that allow us to skip certain statements based on certain Boolean conditions. So before you start, please do read chapter 3 of our textbook. That'll give you better context on what we'll be discussing in this video. So let's review what we know so far, right? So we know there are things called literals, which are examples of which are actual numbers. So it could be 0, it could be -9, it could be a decimal like 0.95, right? We know certain things called data types, right? And we know two of them. We know int, which we have used in our last programming assignment, and we know floats and doubles, and mostly we stick to doubles because that's the easiest thing to do. We know things called identifiers. Identifiers. And these are names for variables, right? These are the actual variable names. So the ones you have used are like apple price. They could be tax and such, right? Okay, so that is what we have so far. And also we know things called statements, right? And there were a couple that I have introduced you to. One is an assignment statement. So for example, you could say num is equal to 45, all right? And statements end with a semicolon. There also another one you know about is a print statement. So that is system.out.println, and then you can print whatever you want inside. Again, ends with a semicolon. So that is what is in our toolbox. And our program so far is just a series of statements, first statement, second statement, and the program just proceeds that way. Then here we have a declaration of an integer data type. The identifier is I, and it's initialized to a literal called 42. Similarly, here we have a data type double. Let's call our identifier D, or variable name D, and it's initialized to a literal called 3.14, right? So now we'll introduce a new data type called Boolean. So Boolean looks very similar. The data type is B-O-O-E-A-N, and let's call this B, and it holds two possible values. It holds true or false. So let's initialize it to true. So now you have learned a new literal, which is true or false. Right. You have a new data type, which is Boolean. All right, so let's see what we can do with these Booleans, right? So Booleans can be initialized to just simple things such as true or false, or they can be initialized to an expression, right? So such an expression would look like this. So you could say that Boolean is true if I is positive. So you could say something like this: if I is greater than 0, then Boolean will hold true. If it's less than 0 or 0 itself, then Boolean would be false. So this greater than expression is called a relational operator, right? So the greater than symbol is a relational operator. You can contrast that with mathematical operators that look like this. For example, you could say something like this, and here you've initialized D, the double, to be 3.14 plus I, which happens to be 42. And plus is an arithmetic operator, greater than is a relational operator. So with that, let's go back to our notes. So we've spoken about Boolean, and it is a new data type. It can hold values true or false. Now, besides this true or false, you can also construct values using this new relational operator, which is less than, greater than, and there are other ones, which is less than or equal to, greater than or equal to, and not equal to. That's how it's written. Okay. So do be careful with this operator, because if you skip one of the equal to signs, then it becomes an assignment. So you have to really be careful not to mix equal to and the assignment operator. Okay. True and false are literals, just like any of the numeric ones we have known so far. Do watch this video. It kind of takes you through a nicely scripted example of using Boolean operators and Boolean expressions and the new if statement that I'll introduce now, right? So we've spoken about Boolean expressions, that just like there are arithmetic expressions, there can be Boolean expressions, and you can mix arithmetic expressions and Boolean expressions. So you can do an arithmetic expression like this. Now do note that in this expression, the multiplication will happen before the plus will happen, the typical mathematical precedence operators. If you really want to do the plus first, you would put a parentheses around the 3 plus 2. You can combine the numeric expression with the relational operator like this. You can say this expression greater than 20, for example. And so, okay, with that we get a new statement, a new type of statement that allows us to do conditional executions. It allows us to skip certain statements or do certain statements based on certain Boolean conditions, right? So it looks like this. You have a new keyword called if, and then you have a Boolean expression such as num less than 0 inside parentheses, and then you have a set of statements within curly braces, right? So let's take an example. If num is integer, you could say that if num is greater than 0, then I'm going to set a Boolean to be true, right? If num is equal to 0 or less than 0, then the is positive will not be set to true. Okay. So very important to consider a couple of things. One is that the parentheses are required around the Boolean expression. And also the curly braces should surround the statements that you in the body of the if statement, right? So now if it's only a single statement that you have in the body, then you can skip the curly braces. So in this case, I only have a single print statement in here. I can just skip the curly braces and I can just have it such. Okay, all this is covered in detail in the preceding video. It kind of takes you through, but I'll just going over it here in summary form, right? Now there is an expanded version of the if statement, which is an if-else statement, and it looks very similar, except it provides you an else clause, right? So here you would first evaluate the Boolean expression. If it happens to be true, then you would do the first block, which has the 3 statements. If it happens to be false, evaluate to false, then you would do these next 2 statements in the else block, right? So now an example here is if num is greater than 0, then you print num is positive, and if it's less than or equal to 0, the first block gets skipped and then the else block gets executed, so it prints num is not positive, right? Okay. So you can also have nested if statements. So you can have if statements within if statements. So let's look at this one. So in this one, we have a very similar statement where we are checking if num is positive, and we have a body, and then there's also an else clause if num is negative, right? Now within num being positive, we have an embedded or a nested if statement. And in this case, it is checking whether num is even. And the way it's doing that is doing the remainder operation. So num divided by 2 and the remainder value. If that is equal to 0, then we say it's even, and else we say it's odd, right? So it's a nested thing. Now you have to be very careful and include the curly braces, otherwise it becomes very confusing which where the else belongs, whether it belongs to the first and second, right? So use curly braces when you have multiple statements, also when you need clarity about what belongs where. Okay, so let's take an example. So we can combine Boolean expressions with things that are called logical operators. So for example, let's say we have an integer value num, which is set to 6, and we want to test whether this is both positive and even in some conditions. So right now here it's only testing when it's positive, and we want to say, hey, this is positive and even. Otherwise, we want to say that it could be negative or could be odd. So the way you would do that is you can combine this check with the check for even by saying, by using the AND operator, which is done by specifying 2 ampersands, and saying num, the remainder operator, 2 equal to operator 0, right? So what we're doing here is saying is that this condition is true if both num is greater than 0 and num remainder is equal to 2, so that means it's even. So it's both positive and even. And if so, print that, otherwise print negative or odd, right? So let's try this. So we have 6. Let's save this file. We'll compile it and we'll run it. And it says it's positive or even. Let's change this to -6, for example. Save it and do the same again. And here it prints negative or odd, right? So again, I just spoke about logical operators. I spoke about the AND operators, which you can combine 2 Boolean expressions. There are other ones which are OR. There's also a NOT, which negates the expression. So if the age is over 18, this will be true if the age is less than 18 or 18 or less, right? There's also an exclusive OR operator, which is only true if one of the participating expressions is true. It's a little obscure. Don't have to worry about it too much. Mostly you will be dealing with AND, OR, and NOT. Okay. Okay, so now you know 3 types of operators. So let's put that in our notes as well, right? So you know these are operators, right, that can be used to combine variables or literals. So you know things like plus, minus, division, and so on, which these are called arithmetic operators, right? Then you know things like less than, equal to, or equal to, or not equal to. These are called relational operators that result in a Boolean. The first set results in another number. This set results in a Boolean. And lastly, now you know the logical operators, which are AND, OR, and NOT, right? So these are logical operators that also again result in a Boolean. Okay, so we've spoken about the if statement, if-else statements, and now we'll introduce one more conditional statement. It's called a switch statement. In other languages, sometimes it's called a case statement. but in Java it's called a switch statement. And it is very similar to an if-else statement. It has a menu type format. So let's review that. So here I've declared two variables. One is an integer called income tier, and the second one is a double called tax rate, right? And in the switch statement, you have a new keyword called switch. Then within parentheses, you specify an expression, right? And this expression needs to have to value to discrete values. So income tier is an integer. It'll have a certain number of values. It might have a 0, 1, 2, 3, and such. And based on what this evaluates to, you will jump to a section. So if the income tier is 1, you will jump to this section, and the statements listed in that section will be executed. It will keep on being executed until you hit a break. When you hit a break, you pop out of the statement, right? So again, you have a keyword switch followed by parentheses, followed by a section within curly braces. The expression here within the parentheses will be evaluated, and it has to have a discrete value. It has to have either integer values or a fixed set of values, and those based on what it evaluates to. If it evaluates to 2, for example, it would jump here and execute the one or more statements listed here. Keeps on going down till it hits a break, and then it pops out, right? If it evaluates to something that is not listed here in this values, then it goes to the default section, it executes those set of statements, and it pops out, right? You will get practice with this in your next assignment, so I won't talk about that too much. You'll get a chance to play around with it there. The most typical use of switch statements that for our class would be to implement a menu, right? Someone shows a menu, and you select a menu choice, and based on that you do different things, and that's exactly what we're using it for in our assignment. Okay. I spoke a little bit about precedence order, introducing a lot of different operators, the arithmetic operators and relational and logical, and even we had things such as auto increment. Those are even operators. And if you can chain them all together in a big expression, and they usually follow a precedent set of rules, so it's done in order. But really, you don't have to worry about this, because you can always force an evaluation order by using parentheses. But I'm presented here. It's covered in more detail in the book, but not something you really run into. I just want you to be aware that if you are chaining a plus with a multiplication, the multiplication is going to be done first because of precedence of multiplication over the plus. All right, so let's move on. In the next assignment, you'll be generating some random numbers, and I've provided you some sample code for generating random numbers. So there's a math function called math_random, which will give you a random number between 0 and 1. So it might give you 0.5 or 0.47 and such, right? And I've given you a trick here to convert that into a number between 1 and 100. So essentially the trick is you multiply that value by 100, so it gets converted to a range between 0 and 99, and then you add 1 to it to convert it to be a random number between 1 and 100. For your assignment, please look to this section on generating random numbers, right? Next, now that you have conditionals like if statements in your toolbox, you might want to detect a condition in your program where something is wrong and you just want to exit the program, right? So if someone's entered an invalid entry, it's a negative entry, you can exit the program by using this command, which is system.exit. All right. One of the things you should be careful about, and a warning that you might get when you're compiling, has to do with initializing variables, right, within conditionals. So in this example, you have a variable called myvar, right, and that has not been initialized. Then you read a value from the outside, from the prompt, and you set it to some variable called numEntry. Based on that decision, you do a conditional. So if the entry is negative, then you initialize myvar. Now you might get a compiler warning because of that, and the compiler say, hey, you're trying to use myvar here in the print statements before you have initialized it, because the compiler doesn't know if during execution whether this thing will ever be executed, right? Because it depends on this condition, right? So you might get that warning. So the simple fix for that is just initialize this variable to 0 so it has a valid value, right? So work through this statement and convince yourself about what I'm talking about here. Lastly, as always, there are multiple things that can go wrong when you're using something new. So let's talk about a few of those, and a few of those you will get practice with during your quiz. So we did talk about, mixing equal to, which is an equality test, versus equal to, which is just an assignment. So for example, in this statement, if you said if equal to, it's really doing an assignment. It's not doing a test for condition. So be careful with mixing those. Next is forgetting the curly braces. So in this statement, looks like we're checking if I is equal to 0, and then we're printing result colon, and then I is equal to 0. But what's really happening, only the first statement is part of the if body, right? Because you don't have curly braces. And this one is outside the if statement, will be printed all the time. So you'll get different behavior, right? So the indentation may make it seem like both are part of it, but in reality, only the first statement is part of the if, right? Another pitfall is by mistake adding a semicolon at the end of an if. So what that's saying is that the body of the if is empty. So you're doing this check and you're saying do nothing if that's the condition. And this statement again is outside the if, is not part of the if body anymore. So it will be printed all the time, right? Lastly, be careful about doing Boolean checks within if expressions. So if you're writing something like if my bool equal to true, it's the same thing as writing if my bool, because what's inside this is a Boolean expression, right? So it's unnecessary really to do something like this, right? Okay, and then there's these other ones called dangling else, and using floating point numbers in Boolean expressions, and duplicating code that you'll be covered in the quiz. So do try that. Okay, so that is it for conditionals and Boolean expressions that are used in conditionals. We learned about if and we learned about switch statements. All right, we'll see you next time.